All right, now before we dive too deep into Polymer, it's important for us to just understand the basic structure of the instrument. If you're already familiar with synthesis, especially subtractive synthesis, this should be pretty straightforward, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's just take a basic tour of the instrument. So we start here in this section with the oscillator. The oscillator is where our sound is generated, and depending on the waveform generated by the oscillator, that will directly influence the timbre or sonic characteristics of the sound. So we're starting off with a pulse oscillator. The waveform looks like this, and if I play it, all right, that's the sound that we hear right now. Now, I can swap this out for different oscillator types, and depending on the oscillator I choose, I'm going to get a different sort of timbre, a different sort of sonic quality. Now, before I switch the oscillator, I do want to point something out. If I look below this, there's an area that says sub, all right, and this is a sub oscillator. This is going to generate a different waveform, one of these, and that waveform can either be the same octave, 1 or 2 octaves below this. So if I want to make a sound that's a bit more full and more thick, using the sub oscillator is a great way to do so. I'm pointing this out right now, though, because the sub oscillator is turned up, so I'm not really hearing this pulse waveform in its purest form. So let me just turn this down. Okay, so that's what the pulse sounds like. Now I can adjust the pulse width, which is going to ultimately adjust the distance between the high and low pulses here. And we can adjust the oscillator sync, which will ultimately make this wave cycle more times per cycle. We can also adjust the frequency here by adjusting the ratio. This allows us to adjust the frequency along the harmonic series or semitones. And we can also do some stereo detuning by enabling this plus minus button. And then we can get some nice simplified unison action happening. All right. So these are things that are happening in the oscillator section. And like I said, we have a sub oscillator here that can also influence that. There's a noise generator too. If you want to add some noise content, this can be really useful for percussive type sounds, for sound effects and textures, things like that. Now, the output of all this gets fed into our filter, and the filter is over here. And just like with the oscillator, we have multiple filter types that we can choose from. The default is a low pass filter. So we're going to let the low frequencies pass through and remove the high ones. We have a knob here for resonance. With resonance, we can essentially increase the gain at the frequency cutoff point. And if we increase the resonance beyond this triangle here, we're going to get this sort of self-oscillating resonance. It's going to start to kind of generate a very audible tone. And when we add a lot of resonance like that, if you want to use that to your advantage, you can actually make the resonant more resonant or just more present by adjusting this parameter here. What is this actually called? It just says non-linearity. But the great thing about Bitwig is that there's a help view. If we go into the inspector panel over here. And just to show you the proper term for this, so if we're looking at the filter section, let me scroll down here. And yes, linearity, how gain is applied for resonance, okay? So by hitting this button here, we're going to get basically more gain applied to more resonant frequencies, so more harmonics. All right, so again, it can be a little shrill, but it's just interesting to note that that's a possibility. So these things happen in the filter section, and if we want, we can just disable the filter as well. Underneath that, we have a filter envelope, so we can shape how the filter is applied over the duration of the notes. To the right of that, we have an amplitude envelope. So by default, typically with a synth, you would have an ADSR envelope, attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now the sustain is the important part here because this means I can hold a note down and just let it sustain for as long as I hold the note. Now let's say I want to make something that's a bit more percussive, a bit more plucky. It could be anything from like, I don't know, more of a bellish type sound, a short piano, even drums and percussive sounds. If that's the case, I can choose one of the other envelopes that does not have the S, which would mean it doesn't sustain, all right? Underneath that, we have some tools for the master section. There's an overall high pass filter, which is post this filter. We can change the overall pitch of our synth patch. We can also enable some pitch glide here if we want. And then here we can adjust velocity sensitivity, the volume of each individual voice, the panning, and the overall volume of our instrument. So there's a lot of things here that we can shape and manipulate. What I want to do first, though, is really discuss what we can do in this oscillator section, because there's quite a bit here that we can manipulate that will give us a good starting point for some cool sounds.